So there we have it. The 2023 season is finally finished, and to be absolutely honest with you, I'm fine with that. Despite the sheer domination from Max Verstappen that has made this year an open and shut case, I think this season hasn't been a bad one or an awesome one. It's been acceptable. The combined force of Max Verstappen and Red Bull this year has just been unstoppable. And whilst he might get knocked off pole position once in a while and given trouble by a car on the first couple of laps, he quickly blasts off into the distance, leaving the other cars to fight for scraps. Now, first things first, the performance from Max this year has been remarkable. Winning 19 out of a possible 22 races this year was an epic performance. And as good as an achievement as it was, for the sake of competition, I really hope some of the teams can take the fight to Red Bull next year. But with Max, I sensed that himself as a driver was making a huge difference, because there was numerous times where whilst he was comfortably leading the race, there was Perez in what was supposedly the same car making life very hard for himself, knocking around in 6th place or somewhere. So the gulf in class between Max and Sergio has been obvious this year, and is probably what Red Bull want to keep long term, because to be honest, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They want to keep the peace, keep Max happy, and not have someone ruffle his feathers. Now, there's a lot of fans out there who are only interested in who finishes first, and if that's your cup of tea, that's totally fine. But despite the domination, despite the Dutch national anthem still ringing in my ears, we've seen some great battles this year. Honestly, I don't think this year was as boring as people say. Remember in other years where perhaps Mercedes were dominating, the grid was split up simply by the cars. We'd see a breakdown where it would be 2 Mercedes, 2 Red Bulls, 2 Ferraris, and so on and so on. There wasn't really much mixing up of the competition. Whereas in 2023, and aside from first position, race to race, you didn't know who was going to finish where. It was so jumbled up behind first position. This year we saw podium positions taken up by Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, Aston Martin, and even Alpine. And that's far more than you can say from other seasons where you might only have 2 or 3 teams making the podium if you're lucky. In 2023, you'll have one race weekend where a team is lightning fast, and then for some reason in the next race, all that pace has completely disappeared. And 2 of the biggest examples here, I think, are Ferrari and Mercedes. The fight for second between Ferrari and Mercedes honestly felt like watching 2 sprinters racing against each other, but their shoelaces were undone and they were just continuously tripping up and falling over each other. I mean, let's be honest, Ferrari and Mercedes were both rubbish this year and suffered terribly from pit stop errors, poor strategy, mistakes, inadequate cars, and driver relations as well. They just seemed to cancel each other out all season, because whilst Ferrari were making terrible strategy calls costing them seconds, Mercedes were incredibly slow doing pit stops, which also cost them valuable seconds. And on the driver front, Leclerc and Sainz were both very unlucky, but meanwhile at Mercedes, Hamilton and Russell were busy taking points off each other and ruining each other's races, so it kind of just evens out. But ultimately, Mercedes finished ahead of Ferrari, but just by a fraction. But there's maybe a chance that these teams looked worse than they actually were, because considering Red Bull, they were exemplary in all areas, aside obviously from Helmut Marko and perhaps Sergio Perez to a degree, but ultimately he came good in the end. It wasn't so much Mercedes and Ferrari finishing runners-up, they were just kind of the least worst all season. Both have a lot of work to do and a lot to sort out for 2024, and I think whilst Ferrari finally have their man in Fred Vasseur, Mercedes are not looking very purposeful recently, and you do have to wonder what exactly Toto Wolff is going to do about it. Toto Wolff being publicly critical about the car is one thing, and I'm no management expert, but surely this can't have gone down well with the team at Brackley, who have given up God knows how many hours to improve the car and just haul every ounce out of it possible. It's like if you owned a restaurant, you would never publicly criticise the chefs or kitchen staff. Quality drops, morale plummets, and weird things start appearing in the soup. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what both of them turn up with in Bahrain in 2024. And then another nice surprise this year was Aston Martin. When you look back to the start of the year, Alonso and Aston gave us a real sense of optimism early on. Cast your minds back to the start of 2023, and the light at the end of the tunnel looked like it was going to be Aston Martin, or more accurately, Fernando Alonso. Early on, it did look like that Alonso might actually have what it takes to take on Red Bull, and that the prophecy might come true and he might actually win his 3rd world title. And they were right behind Red Bull, but as the season progressed, unfortunately they ran out of juice and got swallowed up by Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, and yeah, they just lacked what it took to build the car up and develop it over a course of a season. But let's not forget how exciting it was to watch Alonso at the start of the year. At the start of the year, he looked like a new man. Returning home to Renault, or later Alpine, didn't quite work out. In fact, it wasn't quite returning home. It was more like crashing in your mum's spare room. But after Alpine, Alonso just looked tired and frustrated and as if he was sold a lie. Then he got involved with Aston, and after a few races, it looked like he was almost going to be adopted by the Stroll family. And we saw a level of positivity from Alonso that we hadn't seen in years. And yeah, it was a shame that Vettel decided to hang it up just before this car came into play, but Alonso was a fantastic replacement. But you know who wasn't exciting to watch at the start of the year? McLaren. McLaren began 2023 terribly and were on course for a dreadful season. Honestly, we all thought Daniel Ricciardo had dodged a bullet by getting out of McLaren and that they were once again misfiring and not delivering. When you look at their results up until about Austria, you could be fooled into thinking you're looking at the results of Haas or Alfa Romeo. But credit to them, they worked hard on the car, tightened things up, and from the British Grand Prix onwards, they just came back to life. And this is when we saw Lando Norris being able to show us that he is the real deal and that Oscar Piastri is one to look out for the future. And Piastri even won a sprint race. I mean, it doesn't really mean that much, but that's more than you or I are going to win, so fair play to him. And so because of this late season surge, McLaren were able to challenge the Ferraris and Mercedes. And it was this battle that was going on beneath Max Verstappen that made the season exciting for me. And I hope to God that one or two of these teams can give Red Bull a bit of a battle next year and just try and make their life a bit harder. Because as much as I like seeing teams battle each other throughout the grid, nothing quite compares to that championship decider at the last race. It makes the season so memorable. And speaking about the rest of the grid, we then saw the battle towards the back between Williams, AlphaTauri, Haas, and Alfa Romeo. And you'd think back of the grid, who cares? But this was actually a lot more interesting than normal because all these teams had peaks and troughs throughout the whole season. For example, Haas started the season very well, but they ended up bottom of the pile. AlphaTauri started the season with what was easily the worst car on the grid, but finished it with one that was better than Williams, Haas, and Alfa Romeo. So there wasn't just one consistently hopeless backmarker at the back of the grid this year, and it kind of gave us a battle like you would see in the Premier League with teams at the bottom fighting against relegation. But from all of these, and from my point of view anyway, the best and most exciting to watch was Alex Albon and Williams. Their rise throughout the season with James Vowles in charge was inspiring. And seeing Albon drive the absolute arse off the car and put it into positions it had really no business being was amazing to watch. And Albon is really a driver that you can kind of get behind, especially as he kind of rose out of the ashes of the whole Red Bull situation and has now really found a home at Williams. So yeah, after all this, it's going to be really intriguing to see if Williams are going to consolidate their position next year or try and push forward and aim for 6th and possibly take on the likes of Alpine. Now, something that I thought was disappointing this year was the lack of a silly season or the lack of any big driver movements as we head into 2024. Now, we did see Daniel Ricciardo's return to Red Bull's books and then eventually making his comeback with AlphaTauri, but aside from that, there wasn't a huge amount going on. Then there was that whole palaver around Hamilton and where he was going to end up in 2024 as his Mercedes contract was up. Both him and Russell were retained by Mercedes until 2025, but before that, there was a lot of chatter about him potentially going to Ferrari. And this would have been the biggest driver move that I could remember and one that would have made great TV, but I think ultimately would have been a disaster. And then towards the end of the season, it was revealed that there was some communication between Red Bull and Hamilton's people about a potential drive. And this then became a huge thing. But the reality is this was simply just Hamilton's agent doing his job and seeing what is out there and what he could potentially get. This is his agent doing his job because his client is out of contract next year. And if he wasn't doing this, he wouldn't be doing his job properly. However, despite all this, strap yourselves in for next season though. The majority of drivers have contracts which are expiring at the end of 2024, so 25 is going to see a lot of shake-ups. Potentially some drivers moving around, some new faces being brought in, and some deadwood being cut off as well. And something else we saw on a large scale this year that we hadn't before is the amount of special liveries being used by teams for various reasons. Some were due to sponsors, some were race locations such as Vegas or Monaco, and some were due to fan interactions, where teams let the public contribute designs. And normally special liveries were because of an anniversary or a commercial casual thing or to pay tribute to someone or something. And the floodgates are well and truly open now that teams have tapped into this and realised the benefits of it. But I do worry if teams keep this up, special liveries won't be special anymore. But it was cool to see some of the team's designs though. Some of them actually looked a lot better than the team's regular livery. But yeah, some of the other designs were very half-baked and looked like they were just an afterthought. But ultimately, this season is going to be remembered for Max's sheer and outright domination. A domination that I've never seen in my lifetime, and whilst there is no doubt that it is an enormous achievement and a credit not just to Max, but the team as well, I do hope that someone can get stuck in and make life harder for them. And I get it, on the face of it, and when you look at the stats for the year, all the signs point to it being a boring season. And when there is a lack of competition for first place, that's when a lot of people switch off. And the same goes in other sports as well, whether it's the Premier League, tennis, golf, whatever. But if you look beyond first and see the individual stories and battles that have been going on, those are what have saved and salvaged this season. I remember a lot more boring years than this one, so whilst it hasn't been awesome, it hasn't been dreadful either. So that's why I think it's been acceptable. So there we go. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts on how this season has gone. Love to hear from you. Cheers guys. See you later.